Good afternoon again. Um, Today we're dealing with Chinese history. But before I get there, I want to do another review question. Obviously, now the smoke is cleared. There's going to be a vote of the Faculty Association to accept uh, the agreement, and my guess is that it will be accepted. So we can just proceed to the end of the term uh, normally, if you can call this situation normal. Um, well, first of all, the review question. And the review question, hello? The review question, um, it uh, is about the decline of the Mughal Empire. And this is a relatively simple question to answer. I think obviously the empire was at its height in the 16th century with Akbar, but at the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century, it fell apart under Aurangzeb. And a primary reason is overexploitation. The level of taxation rose between Akbar and Aurangzeb 2.5 times. The peasantry obviously suffered, and their discontent is critical to understanding the collapse. Now, as I explained, it was very difficult to organize class-based movements based on economic interest on any kind of wide area, given the fact that the economy is so localized. The great majority of the peasantry were really more or less cut off from a direct relationship to the state because of the economic localism. But obviously, there was a lot of tribute being extracted from the village, from these villages. Well, we'll get to that in a minute. In any case, the discontent of the peasantry manifested itself in the form of these this sort of individualized religious movement called Bhakti. It started at the beginning of the 16th century, and it gradually developed into a series of religiously based sects, including the Jats, the Sikhs, the Satnamis, and if we can call it that, also the Hindus revolted directly in the form of the Maratha Confederacy. In any case, overexploitation and then the development of religious dissidents, and the crucial thing was that it was not merely a matter of overexploitation, but the zamindars, who were the Brahmins and the Rajputs and perhaps rich peasants, who basically dominated the villages and who were the ones who extracted the tribute and shunted it toward the Mansabdars and the emperor, they began to side with these sectarian movements. And this change in attitude particularly came to the fore in the reign of Aurangzeb, who was, as I was explaining, contrast to his grandfather, Akbar, he reimposed religious taxes on the non-Muslim population. He attacked the Hindu temples. And as a result, during his reign, these sectarian movements, these religious sectarian movements, led now by the Zamindars, basically rebelled. And by the end of the reign of Aurangzeb, 1707, the empire began to disintegrate. Various princes or zamindars broke away and formed breakaway states. And within a few years, there were 7 or 8 of these separate states. The emperor still lived on in Delhi, but he had less and less power. Now then, in terms of concluding this discussion, you should introduce the English East India Company and basically to a certain extent the development of this company and the basis of trade, and then during the 7 Years' War, it rebels against the Nabob of Bengal, and with its well-trained European army and its Indian allies, it conquers Bengal, and then between 1757 and 1818, it conquers the rest of India. So that's the story. Are there any questions about what I've said? Good. Okay, let's now move on to China. I gave you an overall view of China in the last class. Now I want to deal with its history in more detail, and in particular, what we're going to be concerned with is the period known as the Ming China, the Ming Dynasty. Right here, its dates are given 1368 to 1644. But we'll open with an overview leading up to the emergence of the Ming Dynasty. Now, we saw that Chinese history, like the history of the Middle East or Latin America for that matter, it's very old, 2700 BC. You have Bronze Age civilization developing. In the 16th century BC, the Shang dynasty became the first sort of significant state to emerge in China. It certainly didn't cover all of China, but in eastern China, the Shang dynasty was the first important state. And from that point onwards, you do begin to get historians writing the history of these different emperors and dynasties. Some of the histories are really quite good. And I think that history in this sense, the emergence of this history reflects the fact that the Chinese state was strong, in a certain sense, stronger than the Mughals or the Ottomans, or for that matter, most of the European states, or all of the European states until the 17th century. So China was quite a strong state from a very early age, and it's reflected in the fact that they had historians. So there's this kind of cohesion, and the cohesion was reinforced by the fact that ethnically, the Chinese population was of that ethnic group known as the Han. The Han are overwhelmingly the predominant ethnic group in China, single ethnic group. There are minorities that even today, there's maybe 15% of the Chinese population are made up of other peoples, but the Han are overwhelmingly the dominant ethnic group. And that also, of course, obviously reinforced the cohesion of Chinese society. Now, in terms of uh, the ruling ideology of China, um, it was the teachings of this philosopher who lived back in the 5th century BC, Confucius, um, which was a kind, as I'll explain, a kind of ethical and moral philosophy. Um, this under the already in the Han Dynasty, that is to say, in the 1st century BC, the Confucianism became the official ideology of the Chinese state. There were other ideologies prior to this full emergence of Confucianism as dominant. There were rival ideologies, as a matter of fact, but they were all eclipsed, and Confucianism became the official ideology of the Chinese state, and it exercised overwhelming influence over the ruling elites and ruling class, which essentially were the landlords and the mandarins who dominated the landlord class and dominated the state. Now, as I was explaining last time, it's during the period of the Qin, sometimes the Qin, but today we use the term Qin, and the Han dynasties between the 2nd and century BC and the 2nd century AD, at the time of the Roman Empire. This is when Confucianism becomes dominant. And this, of course, is the period when China becomes a unified and centralized state covering most of Eastern China. Well, maybe I can show that on the map. The notable thing here is that, yes, we can see, if I can bring this down, we can see that Eastern China, this area here, the Han state of the period of the Roman Empire basically included this eastern and richest part of China. It did not include Mongolia, which became part of China in the 17th century, and that it did not include Western China, which tends to be less prosperous. It was this region here that was put together by the Qin and the Han dynasty back at the time of the Roman Empire, and it became an organized state. Now, following this unification, many centuries went by between the Han dynasty, 2nd century AD, and the emergence of the Ming dynasty in the 14th century. In fact, there were no less than 11 changes in dynasties between in other words, ruling families that provided by hereditary succession, emperors. Well, there were 11 dynasties between this period. Although I did note that, in fact, unlike Europe, China remained a centralized and indeed quite advanced and prosperous civilization during the so-called Dark Ages of Europe. There was a real contrast here. The Tang period and the Song period were periods of great achievements on the part of China. Now, the emperor had absolute authority. It's like the sultan in the Ottoman Empire or the emperor in under the Mughals. The power of the emperor was absolute. Um, uh, he ruled because it was said that it was the will of heaven. Um, Indeed, the overall concept that covered this was the Chinese concept of the mandate of heaven. A dynasty, in terms of the Chinese ideas at that time, was held to have the right to absolute rule because they enjoyed the mandate of heaven. Heaven had granted them this absolute power. And so while the dynasty lasted, um, the power of the emperors in this dynasty were absolute. Um, and based on the authority of the emperor, in the course of this period that I'm discussing, from the Han uh, to the Ming dynasty, an elaborate bureaucracy consisting of tens of thousands of officials basically controlled the empire in the name of the emperor. Officials obviously operating out of Beijing or Nanjing in the court, but then local officials, who made um, the bureaucracy work. And in this way, China was very different from Western Europe or the Ottoman Empire or the Mughal Empire, because it was not um, the warrior aristocracy, and it was not the religious elite that dominated the society. In those other civilizations, as I've made evident, um, the religious and military elites played a huge role. Now, there was a military elite in China, but it was subordinated to the bureaucracy. The civilian bureaucrats were the people who had the most prestige and the most power, as a matter of fact. And the military commanders were more or less always subordinated to this civilian bureaucracy. Now, that is not to say that religion was without influence in China. No, that's of course not true. We can note that Buddhism, coming from India, um, played a big role in Chinese religious life. And there was another a religious ideology known as Taoism. Taoism, which also was important. So Buddhism and Taoism were important. All over the place, there were Buddhist and Taoist monasteries, monks, and what have you. The point is that they had no real political influence. So I'm saying that the warrior element and the religious element, of course, they existed and were significant, but they were always subordinate to the emperor and these bureaucrats. Now, these bureaucrats had a name. They were called mandarins. The mandarins, the Mandarin elite. They were the ones who basically ran the state for the emperor. They were the ones who did the routine administration, kept the records, collected taxes, and also they're the ones who wrote the official histories that I mentioned earlier. So they were essentially government bureaucrats who ruled in the name of the emperor. Now, what was particularly notable about this group was uh, these people did not get to the position that they enjoyed simply as a result of heredity or some sort of personal favor extended by the court. No, gradually there developed what we call an examination system, which came to be officially accepted by the Chinese state under the Sung dynasty in the 10th century. China-wide state examinations were held every year. And these state examinations, which were based on Confucianism, you were examined in the degree to which you had mastered Confucian philosophy. And this, if you got an A plus on the examination, or even an A, you became one of these mandarins. Otherwise, too bad. You had to go home, and of course, many of the people who sat these examinations, most of them, in fact, came from the landlord class. But to be a Mandarin was really to be in an exceptional position, because not only you, but your family could benefit enormously if you were part of this intellectual elite. And so I would say that this Mandarin bureaucracy recruited by examination actually enjoyed, from a political point of view, they dominated Chinese society really until the 20th century. These Mandarins, they and their families were very favored. And that helps to explain why in China, students are regarded with special regard. To be a student in China is something special, because historically, this was the gateway to becoming a member of the Mandarin class. And even though China, of course, has dramatically changed, nevertheless, even in the late 19th and 20th century, to be a student right until now is very important in China. And indeed, a lot of political movements in China, the Chinese students tend to be quite interested in politics, which, I mean, obviously we in Canada, some students are interested in politics, but the majority are not. Politics are dismissed in Canada. Oh, that's political, is what people say in Canada, which is, of course, ridiculous. Politics are all important, but people have this attitude, this apolitical attitude. Well, that's not the way the Chinese are. And this stems back from this early experience. Now, the Mandarin class was recruited from the landlords. There were a few bright peasant boys, if they were particularly intellectually endowed, and of course, women are completely excluded. This is totally male-dominated society. The men amongst the peasantry, if there were young lads who were brilliant, a local landlord might sponsor such a boy, and he might be able to sit the state examinations. And there were a few people from the peasantry. It was a good idea to do this from the point of view of the rulers, because it tended to co-opt into the ruling elite the brightest element amongst the lower classes. So it was clever, actually, to include these well-endowed peasant boys in sitting the examinations. Well, the Mandarin class and this bureaucracy, which functioned, given the nature of these medieval and early modern bureaucracies, functioned way better than the bureaucracies in Europe or in the Middle East or in India. China as a result of this setup, enjoyed, for the most part, a great deal of stability and indeed prosperity. The standard of living in China was in every way comparable or indeed superior to anything that existed in the other societies I've mentioned. And moreover, from the point of view of science and technology, China was in the lead. Um, the Europeans were way back, and it really wasn't until the 17th, 18th century that Europe begins to come up to the Chinese level and indeed to surpass it. Coincident, of course, with the full development of capitalism. Now, I want to go into what Confucianism was all about so that you fully understand this. Now, Confucianism was, it was not religious. Religion, Confucius and the commentators on Confucius said that religion was important. It ensured the stability of society, especially given the credence, the superstition of the common people. Religion reinforced the authority of the state and the stability of society. So religion was respected, I would put it this way. But Confucianism was all about morality and metaphysics, and it did not explain things in religious terms. Instead, this philosophy, which, as I said, was the philosophy of the Mandarin class, but also of the landlords went to school. Remember, they were training for these exams. They all went to school in hopes of becoming Mandarins. They all imbibed and were indoctrinated into Confucianism. Well, Confucianism basically taught respect for authority, obedience towards the government, but also towards the family and older people. And in terms of its overall attitude towards the structure of society, respect your elders, respect those who are superior to you, respect your mother and father and the elders in your family, and respect the government, defer to what the government says. And they put a lot of stress on the fact that if you lived a moral life based on this attitude, if you as a member of the landlord class lived morally or ethically, or if you were a Mandarin, you were not corrupt, you were not venal, but you lived an exemplary life, the rest of the population would respect you and defer to what you said. And so the idea was to govern by example, which is an interesting idea. In other words, those in authority, and this was true a large part of the time, did set an example for the rest of society. Now, I'm not saying, of course, there was a lot of corruption and, as you see, a lot of social conflict. But I'm saying, and overall, it's not a bad idea. It certainly contrasts with the ideas of Machiavelli when you think about it. But the rulers should govern by example. And there's another thing I want to say about this, and that is, look how this philosophy is basically based on respect for tradition, respect for the whole Confucian way. The past is the basis on which society ought to operate, so on. But we have government by this intellectual elite, and government by setting an example. Now, this helps to explain, in my opinion, I'm coming to the present, why, in a way, um, communism had an easy time establishing itself in China. Because it is, we can't really talk about, in China at least, maybe I could make an argument that, say, communism in Cuba had an important democratic element to it. I don't think one can do that with respect to China. But the Chinese are used to being governed by an intellectual and moral elite. This is the way they have been governed for centuries, for millennia. And so what I'm trying to suggest is that the fact that the Communist Party projects itself in Chinese society in the same way is credible to the Chinese population, especially because, as a matter of fact, in comparison to what China has experienced in the past, the rule by the communists has been spectacularly successful. So maybe that's an insight. Think about it. In any case, in the end, then what I'm saying is that from the landlord class through examination, the way was open to becoming a Mandarin, to becoming part of the Mandarinate. That's the way China was governed. Meanwhile, the masses, of course, were excluded from all of this. The greater part of the wealth, the greater part of the prestige, it all went to the landlords and to the mandarins. And the masses had no education. And so what the masses knew was what we can speak about as folk superstition or religion, magic, fortune telling, ancestor worship, the worship of the ancestors in your family, Buddhism and Taoism. This was available to the mass of the population. And as I point out in the lecture notes, fortune telling was very common and very popular in China. You threw the dice, and the dice, and depending how they came up, you could interpret the dice as explaining why you were poor or why somebody else was rich. So this state that I've been talking about, this Mandarin state, dominated by an absolute emperor, basically was recruited from the landlord class, and it acted in behalf of the landlord class. Clearly, it's not that sometimes they didn't act against particular landlords, but overall, when push came to shove, the state acted in behalf of the landlords. And this overall power of the mandarins and the landlords was reflected at the village level. It sprang from the realities at the village level because the landlords and some of the rich peasants constituted about 5% of the population of China. But they typically owned something like 70% of the land in a village would be owned by the rich landlords and the landlords and the rich peasants. And these people also controlled the draft animals that pulled the plows, the carts, the tools and implements that people used. The peasantry as a whole couldn't own any of this. They had to go to the rich peasants and the landlords in order to get access, even to the tools and the draft animals that they used. I would note that in China, as a matter of fact, in contrast to the Mughals and to the Ottomans, private property did exist in China. It wasn't the only form of property, but private property was allowed permission, legal, in China. Um, the so in some ways comparable or even ahead of Western Europe. Now, the rest of the population, so I said that 5% own most everything. The other 90 or 95%, consisting of poor and middle peasants and hired workers, constituted the other 95% of the population. And they owned only maybe 30% of the land. Those amongst this group owned about 30% of land. Furthermore, the landlords, they controlled the local government, the Buddhist and Taoist temples, the benevolent societies that looked after the sick or the orphan, the legal system, the courts, the judges, they all came from the landlord class. So bottom line is the power of the landlords, backed up by the state, was overwhelming, and most of the time the peasants basically accepted that situation. They bowed down before the overwhelming power of the landlords. However, there were times when times which were bad, when there was famine, not enough to eat, when the peasants fell into debt en masse, when taxation became too heavy, including the state forcing the peasantry to work for the state on state projects like canals or roads or so on. If things got too bad, if there was accumulation of bad times, the Chinese peasantry rebelled. And as a matter of fact, based on research into the histories of China, which stretch back, of course, to the second millennium BC, way back in history, over hundreds, many centuries, we know of over 1,000 small and large-scale uprisings on the part of the peasantry. So that we can say that in China, there was not only private property, but there was class war in China. Unlike India or the Ottoman Empire, but similar to Europe. Classes existed in China, and there was class conflict in China right through its history. And this, I would say that people could say that class conflict is a bad thing, but as a matter of fact, it gives a certain dynamism to society. The clash between the upper and the lower classes helps to vitalize, historically, certainly the development of Western Europe into an advanced capitalist society was the result of class conflict. And similarly, there is a similar dynamism in Chinese society, which of course leads to the question, well, could not capitalism have developed in China alongside Europe? And the answer is yes, it could have. And there were signs, for example, in the 16th century, when actually capitalist industries did develop in China during the prosperous 16th century, operating on the basis of private property. I'm thinking particularly of the vast ceramics and pottery works in Western China. But what I would say is, and this of course would mean the development of a middle class. Well, as you'll see, there was a middle class in China, but it was the state acting for the landlord class that constantly checked the full development of a middle class in China and blocked the development of capitalism. So now we come to the uh, emergence of the Ming Dynasty. Now, the Ming Dynasty, which you see takes power in the 14th century, actually developed out of one such class conflict. A great class uprising developed, particularly in southern China, in the first part of the 14th century. And it was this that led to the overthrow of the previous dynasty. The Yuan dynasty was ruling in China prior to the Ming, and a class conflict. The peasantry revolted against the Yuan dynasty, and one of these peasants, by the name of Zhu Wanzhang, he was a peasant. He began to lead these peasant armies in southern China, and first of all, he took over the then capital, Nanjing, and he ultimately moved the capital to Beijing, and he was the founder of the Ming Dynasty. So Zhang leads this revolt against the Yuan dynasty, and he is the founder of the Ming Dynasty. Now, I have to sort of elaborate what I just said. This is all true. It was a peasant revolt, but it was also a revolt by the Han ethnic group, which I said was the overwhelming majority, over the rule of the Mongols. Because as a matter of fact, the Yuan dynasty had come into being as a result of an invasion by the Mongols. The Yuan dynasty were Mongols. I think Genghis Khan was a Mongol. And they invaded and conquered China in 1279 and established their rule. Well, there was a certain resentment against the Mongol rule, and also the fact that they were oppressive against the peasants. And this is the combination of a kind of ethnically based uprising and peasants' revolt is what overthrew the Mongols and installed the Ming dynasty. Just by way of one of the good things that the Yuan dynasty did was open up the Silk Road. I mentioned this in the last class. But overall, they were not acceptable to the mass of the Chinese population, and they were overthrown. Now, I want to note, because it's important in a global sense, that these Mongols also, not only did they take over China, but they took over most of Russia at the same time. A lot of Russia until the 15th century, from the late 13th, 14th century until the mid 15th century, was under Mongol rule as well. And further, we should note, of course, that in the Middle East, based on pressure from the Mongols, you have this descent of the Turks, the Seljuks, the Mamelukes, ultimately the Ottomans. They pressed down from Central Asia, being driven by the Mongols. So there is a kind of unity going on here, which one notes. Now, in the wake of this widespread uprising and the abuses of the Yuan period, Zhu Wanzhang set about instituting a sweeping renovation of Chinese society. First of all, he stressed the unity of the Chinese state, unifying making sure that the central government dominated the whole society. So there was that. Secondly, he sponsored, he supported the reconstruction of Chinese agriculture based on basically a redistribution of the land. A lot of the land was taken away from the landlords, much to their chagrin, and given to the peasants. The landlords at this time had control, as we've seen, had control of most of the land. Well, under this first emperor, 50% of the land was fell into the hands of the peasants. From a low of 30%, there was a land distribution which gave the peasants in total some 50% of the land. And also a reconstruction of the Chinese state based on two things. First of all, a revival of the ethics of Confucianism, a very strong re-invoking of the traditional ruling philosophy, Confucianism. But also, and this is important, he made sure that 50% of the mandarins who passed the examination were of peasant origin. In other words, he opened up the whole examination system to the peasantry. And the mandarinate was reinforced, was revived by the fact that many a young and intelligent peasant boy made their way upwards into Chinese society at the beginning of the Ming period. And so the combination of re-centralization, agricultural reconstruction, and a revival of the state based on Confucianism and the opening up of the state to the peasants, to some of the peasants, helped to revive the Chinese state. We're getting close to the end, but let me finish these reforms. Furthermore, the army, which had grown, the armies were vast in China. The army under this first emperor, it was 2 million men army, standing army of 2 million men. This goes back to the period of the Roman Empire at its height. Well, the emperor decreed that the soldiers would have to feed themselves. They could not take grain from the peasantry. They had to basically raise their own crops and livestock and feed themselves so that they were not a burden on the peasants, which in ordinary times, of course, such an army would be. Then he ordered the construction of a vast network of canals, of roads, all across China during this first emperor. And finally, he reorganized the bureaucracy, allowing a lot of the decisions to be taken at the local level. In other words, he tried to decentralize the state, make it more efficient and less cumbersome on the population by decentralizing the state to the local level. So his Zhu Wanzhang, a peasant boy, his reign was a great success and allowed the dynasty to perpetuate itself over 300 years. And we'll see how this developed in the next class. See you then on Friday.